Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the escalating threats from the Iranian regime, the European foreign policy position on Iran, and the U.S. sanctions policy towards the Iranian regime. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Tzvi Kahn, senior Iran analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Matt Brodsky, senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. Thank you so much both for joining me today. Tzvi, you've been with us before. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us for the first time. Obviously, we're going to be focusing a lot on Iran today. In terms of what we saw, let's begin with the ships that were attacked by drones that have to do, or we don't even know, explosions. We know that the accusations are against the Iranian regime, and that happened around the waters of UAE. Let's start with that. And what do you think happened specifically in those instances? Because we don't know a lot of details about the amount of damage that was caused. How severe was that attack by the Iranian regime?
Well, I think, the Iranian regime has denied responsibility for this attack. At the end of the day, this attack is not going to have, a huge impact on oil supplies or shipments in the Middle East. However, I think although Iran has denied it, I think it's probably almost for sure that Iran is responsible. And that's consistent with Iran's playbook throughout the Middle East over the years. What it typically does is it often acts through proxies. This gives it a sort of distance or even plausible deniability that makes it harder for the international community to blame Iran directly. And in so doing, it can send a message to the United States that it's ready to act, it's willing to retaliate, but at the same time, it can sort of deter a sort of hardline response or an intense response from the United States. So at the end of the day, I actually look at these kinds of incidents and I see it as a sign of weakness almost on Iran's part, because they know full well that in any conventional military conflict with the United States, they would almost certainly lose. It would be no match. And that's why they resort to these kind of attacks. And it's in the end an expression of weakness on their part, not really an act of aggression that poses a meaningful threat to the United States or our interests in the region.
I think I would add to that on the military side, what they're trying to do is show that they have the ability to harass a lot of ships, oil tankers, in the Straits of Hormuz, especially given the location. If you just look at one of those maps to see where the traffic is passing, this is designed to say that we can make life very difficult for you. And when you put that in the context of the other activity that it's doing throughout the region, you really see that Iran is trying to hold the entire Middle East, the entirety of it, in hostage. This isn't just about the Straits of Hormuz. This is also their activity in Iraq, in Syria, and all of this type of activity was before this action that he was pointing to as a part of their playbook. This has existed before the nuclear deal went into effect. This is why it was dangerous that its behavior was never actually addressed in that. And we should also note that a lot of this activity has also taken place during the implementation of the deal. So when there's going to be an argument that is sure to come that is going to say the United States is being very provocative, and that is why Iran is taking these type of measures, we should all understand this is what they do. And we must be prepared to push back against that.
And then we saw the other incident with attacking in Saudi Arabia's petroleum stations that are under Aramco. How much could they actually hurt Saudi Arabia and the countries using that very major oil supply in the world?
Well, certainly they have the ability to cause a great deal of mischief if they really wanted to. But again, I don't think they're likely to do so because the risks are too great for them. And I think building on just actually what Matt just said, after President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, there were a lot of dire predictions that Iran would immediately withdraw from the JCPOA as well. That would ramp up its breakout time. It would accelerate its move towards nuclear weapons. That would ramp up its aggression throughout the region. And while certainly Iran's mischief has continued, we haven't seen a significant escalation per se on Iran's part. On the contrary, what we've seen on Iran is actually a sort of desperation to save the deal. They want and need the deal far more than we do. And that's why these kinds of incidents that are occurring right now are actually, I think, an effort really to almost blackmail Europe to say that if you don't give us the economic relief that we were expecting to receive under the deal, you can expect consequences. But the very fact that a year later, a year after the deal, they actually haven't really imposed any significant consequences. They haven't launched a new war. They haven't really attacked directly or sponsored a new wave of terrorism in the region. That to me is a sign that the Iranian regime is actually afraid. They're in almost a state of paralysis because they actually just don't know what to do. They haven't really responded very much to the protests in Iran. They don't clearly have any kind of a solution, and that's why to this day all we really see from them is a lot of bluster, a lot of threats, a lot of threatening rhetoric, but not actually too many actions that actually poses a real threat to us. And I think that is likely to continue for at least in the near term.
What do you think, Matt? I mean, you're talking about Iran actually systematically now showing what it could do, right?
Right.
Tzvi seeing it as but at the same time, they're very vulnerable right now.
Right.
I mean, do you agree that this is probably the last resort for the Iranian regime, that if they will go that route, they're actually putting their own survival at stake?
Right. Well, I think it is an act of desperation on their part. There's no doubt that the pressure that we have put on them, the sanctions, are having an incredible bite. And incidentally, a lot of that is just our own pressure. To put this in the context of how the United States sacrificed our own leverage in order to arrive at a deal that didn't even address this type of behavior, because this behavior is not really nuclear related. That is a separate issue. This is just the Iranian playbook in the Middle East. So what he was saying is absolutely correct. The target here is Europe. They want Europe to put pressure on the United States to say, see what you've caused. We need to get back in the deal. And the United States needs to stand resolute and say, this is Iran without nuclear weapons. Imagine how they're going to behave when they have nuclear weapons, which is the path we set them on by sticking to this type of a deal.
And I mean, I just want to go back to that point. How far is Iran willing to go right now? Because going that route also might have consequences with an administration that seems to be a little bit more serious than they expected. I mean, that would start also with the sanctions, completely tying those knots on the Iranian regime's economical.
I think they might be misreading the United States and this president, who is far harder to read. I mean, I think President Trump is hard enough even for those working around him to sometimes gather what it is he plans to do. But the fact is, whereas in the previous Obama administration, you would have a type of comments like, it would be madness if we were to try to do anything militarily against Iran, coming from our military leaders, that doesn't really send much of a strong signal to Iran that you're willing to do anything. Right now, when you look at the what we've moved in the United States militarily as a response, not only just to shore up our ground bases in Iraq and Syria, the return of the USS Lincoln strike group, the B-52, the B-52s, I should say, apparently in Qatar, the UAE, whatever, it's. We made a point of taking many pictures of them and releasing them online from a military standpoint, just carrying out an exercise. They've shown what our other aircraft have, designed for air-to-air operations. In other words, these type of bombers are capable of carrying the mother of all bombs, as they're called here, which under this president, as we recall, actually dropped one in Afghanistan just to kind of say, we have this, it does a lot of damage, we can use it. That's supposed to send a very strong message as well. So if Iran thinks that there's some divide in the United States that, we're war weary and we don't really want to respond to this type of a threat, I think it would be a miscalculation.
Do you think, Tzvi, that basically now we know that there was the actual reports and the intelligence reports that were given to the administration were correct. And that's why the United States sent and deployed all of these military ships and more bombers, etc., to the region. I mean, that proves that Iran was preparing to some damage.
I have no way of knowing what the specific intelligence was, so I can't answer that specifically. I don't think the administration would go to this effort or would make these deployments if they didn't think there was a threat, though. So at the end of the day, I take the administration at their word that there was a significant threat that they needed to respond to. Having said that, a lot of the predictions that we've been hearing, I think from critics of the president, is that we're on the verge of war. This is going to increase tensions to the degree that there could be an explosion in the Middle East, or perhaps it will produce an accidental conflict that will escalate. I think that those scenarios are extremely unlikely. What these deployments are trying to do is basically a form of coercive diplomacy. It's a way of saying, or I believe it was Ambassador Huntsman who said this is 100,000 tons of coercive diplomacy, or something to that effect. And I think that's exactly right. The United States is simply sending a message to Iran, is that if you don't change, if you don't change your bad behavior, there are going to be significant consequences. And trust us, if any conflict is going to hurt you a lot more than it's going to hurt us. And I think Iran knows that. And I think that's why they're not going to launch an escalation. And it's very unlikely that there's going to be a conflict, at least in the near future.
From the Iranian side?
Correct.
They're not going to escalate further. That's your prediction?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, to be sure, I don't think they're simply going to withdraw all its forces from the Middle East. They're still going to continue to sponsor its proxies, at least in the near term. But I don't anticipate like a head-on military conflict between the United States and Iran, or at least a significant escalation beyond the kind of chaos or mischief that we're seeing today.
Would we be, would it be fair to say that this type of back and forth, when the United States pressures Iran that much and then we see this type of attack, that probably it's going to be a situation where we're going to be seeing unfolding where the Gulf is going to be maybe the biggest victim, let's say, of this whole thing? I mean, if Iran could continue to strike in these areas because they're very convenient,
Iran is sending,
with no significant response from the United States, wouldn't that be a very dangerous thing to the United States allies?
I think Iran is sending multiple messages throughout the region. I think even if you were to look at what occurred in Gaza just a few weeks ago, and we see that this was Iran's proxy, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, that did it. They were the ones driving this. If you were to look then at who Israel then targeted, those that were killed, the terrorists that were killed, half of them, 8 of the 16, were from Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They were unveiling new rocket technology that most analysts would say either transferred from Iran or Hezbollah. You add that to what is happening with missile production facilities that Iran turned on again in 2016 while we were in the deal, before Trump was in office, inside of Iraq, these missile factories, because Iran is transferring the technology so that its own proxies in Iraq can create their own missiles. And of course, the nonstop transfer of precision-guided munitions, smaller items that are going to be fixated on dumb rockets that Hezbollah can use throughout the region to attack. And then, of course, Yemen. The Gulf is certainly where you can get, as we would say, the most bang for your buck as far as a terrorist attack or making some kind of point along the line of escalation. But they have no shortage of theaters around the area.
And other areas
that
of the region as well.
Right.
What would you say about that, Tzvi?
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely with what Matt just said. Obviously, Iran has options, but certainly what happened in Gaza is one way you can go about it. But all of these at the end of the day, all of these efforts are, in a certain sense, a way to escalate or a way to respond to the United States without actually triggering a direct counterattack against Iran itself. So in the end, I see Iran as they're striking out blind. They're looking for ways to respond, precisely because they know they don't have the leverage or the ability to meaningfully challenge the United States.
Now we saw that the Houthis are actually carrying out terrorist attacks. Evidently. Would that change the European position? And even, some people in American media or the left wing in the United States that are basically really upset at what's happening in Yemen, blaming only Saudi Arabia, but at the same time not acknowledging what the Houthis are doing and the fact that they are an Iranian proxy. I mean, why aren't we seeing that change? And do you think we're going to start to see the effect of having these proxies, committing these terrorist attacks that would be in every front in the region?
I think Houthi violence or terrorist attacks isn't anything new per se, but in the context of Europe, I think Europe is deeply invested in the nuclear deal. They see it as among their signature foreign policy achievements of the last decade, and they deeply believe that the deal prevents Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and that by having it in place, it could have the effect of even moderating or at least giving room for Europe to deal with Iran, to negotiate it with it, to perhaps change their behavior on a diplomatic front. And I don't see much evidence that this view has changed since Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA. On the contrary, I would say they've hardened this view. And that's why they've been fighting, kicking, and screaming against the administration in an effort to even try to create economic back channels, like a special purpose vehicle to bypass U.S. sanctions. But what we've seen, though, is that most European companies are not going along, because regardless of what European policy might be, most European companies recognize that if they had to choose between Iran's $400 billion economy or the United States' $20 trillion economy, they're going to go with the United States. And the risks of doing business with Iran are just too great for them to change. So, that's not. So Europe, I think, is going to still, unfortunately, continue with its delusions about the nuclear deal, frankly, regardless of what's likely to happen in the region.
Mm-hmm. Even though that now with those terrorist attacks, they're targeting petroleum and oil supplies that would affect the world economy. Even though this is happening, we're going to continue to see, in your opinion, the backing of the EU countries that are involved in the JCPOA.
They're going to they're trying to do everything they can to save the JCPOA.
Is it savable?
Look, for all intents and purposes, the deal is largely dead. With the United States withdrawing and with the reimposition of sanctions, there is very little benefit that Iran is getting from the deal. I would say, though, that I think Iran is still hoping that they can persuade Europe. I think they're hoping that President Trump will lose re-election in 2020, and therefore any Democrat in the White House would be likely to re-enter the JCPOA and reinvigorate sanctions relief. But I think another reason why Iran is very intent on keeping the JCPOA and still hasn't fully withdrawn from it even after a year is because, in a way, the JCPOA legitimizes its nuclear program. Contrary to, it basically says Iran can keep an industrial-scale nuclear facility and enrich uranium without meaningful consequences from the international community. And I think that's one reason, another reason why they want to save this deal so badly, because then without it, they're at a situation where any nuclear activity they conduct becomes illegal and subject to sanctions and isolation.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. And the problem, I think, with fixing the deal, and this is, again, why the pressure is being applied on Europe first, is because you have a lot of the same stakeholders inside of Iran who helped put together this deal, who feel that this is the crowning achievement, right? So what we want to do is then just a little bit here, a little bit there, and then is it enough? Okay, are you okay, United States? It's not. Okay, when you have a regime with a proven track record that we have here, where we haven't seen the manifestation of the good Iranian regime, it's just been acting as it does, then it's hard to see how giving them the right to enrich uranium to the level that it would be able to, it makes any sense. It's just not something that you can trust. It's one thing when you have a country that sticks to international agreements, that's a different type of situation. That's not what we're dealing with Iran, and it's not like they're bashful about sending their signals, whether it's in the media or militarily, whether it's throughout the region. They're quite clear on what they want, and they go about doing it. The fear point may be that they feel a bit more cornered, because the fact is the pressure is really on them, and this is dire circumstances for them. But the fact remains that they are going to respond to pressure. We've already seen that they're going to pocket concessions and rewards and continue along the path that they've been on.
Yeah, nothing changed basically in terms of Iran's action in the region with the JCPOA or without it. I mean, this is for sure. But I do want to ask, unless you want to say something, because I felt like you want to say something.
Oh, go ahead. It's okay. Yeah.
No. I mean, I kind of wanted to ask about Iraq, because we saw that there were some warnings and in a very tough language by Secretary Pompeo. I mean, Iran has infiltrated Iraq. I mean, we know that, but now it's a little bit, there's a shift going on. The Shia majority of Iraq are unhappy with Iran. Al-Sadr is not very pro-Iran. And then the United States is now threatening and warning Al-Hajj al-Shabi, the popular muse, from whatever the activities that they're doing in Iraq. Is it a realistic bet by the American administration to actually, especially that they're asking Iraq to pump up their oil production, which is going to hurt Iran more? I mean, this is now we're seeing a change. How much can we expect that a change in that dynamic between Iran and Iraq, with knowing the infiltration, especially with the Shia extremist militias?
Well, I do take the administration at their word when they say there was a threat coming from Iraq that they needed to respond to. What I think is notable, though, is that to date, we haven't actually seen a specific attack or an escalation. And that, I think, contradicts, a lot of the fears that people had when the Trump administration decided to designate the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization. I mean, one of the counter arguments you heard at the time was that if we do this, then it could lead to an escalation in Iraq. Now that perhaps that will occur, so far it hasn't. But I think at the end, I don't think there's anything. The argument basically seems to be that if you call a terrorist organization a terrorist, then they might actually behave like terrorists. And I don't think that's a reasonable response. At the end, you respond to terrorists as they are, and you call them by name, and you act accordingly. So while I suppose it's certainly possible that we might see an increase of tensions in Iraq, the fact that it hasn't occurred yet, I think, is notable. And I think the administration is taking exactly the right steps to make sure that Iran knows that there will be consequences. And hopefully, I think this might go a long way in deterring Iran from any future escalation.
What would you say about that?
I think the verdict is still out. Iraq has to tread a very careful line, and we've had issues there. It hopefully, the one thing I think that maybe we can rely on is that Iran, wherever it goes, it does not fare well amongst the population, really. It's not like Syrians are saying, thank you, Iran, by any stretch of the imagination. I think in Iraq, when they overplay their hand, even though there's obviously a majority Shia population there, when they overplay their hands, this ends up being something that I don't think the population appreciates. I think they've also have a history of misjudging that. They did that in the Iran-Iraq war, thinking that they would have a lot more support, and we're talking decades ago. But this is something that we've seen from the revolutionary regime. It would be interesting we'll wait to see what happens, but clearly it's a concern that we have.
Which is, I mean, true. Even if you talk about Lebanon, they don't say thank you, Hezbollah. The same thing in Gaza, they don't think thank you, Hamas. So this is, I think, as an ongoing assessment of what's happening, and that includes the Iranian people. But how much is the administration willing to go now, knowing that there's all these deployments of military, American military? But I mean, how much is the administration willing to go? And I know that there's a lot of voices that are afraid, and they're saying that the administration is being provocative. But there is a terrorist activity by this regime, and it might continue, and might escalate. Is the United States willing to go, all in a conflict, in a military conflict with the Iranian regime?
I think the United States is trying to do everything it can to avoid war. I don't think that's really what President Trump wants. It's not, I think, what the American people want, and I don't think it's likely to occur. Now, if they felt it was absolutely necessary, if they felt that they had to make massive deployments into the Middle East to prevent Iranian attack, I think Trump, if he felt forced to do it, then he would come to the American people and make the case. But I look at what the administration is doing now as an effort to avoid that, actually to strengthen its deterrence and to increase its leverage for any prospective negotiations in the future. President Trump has said, as well as many administration officials, that they're looking to reach a new deal with Iran. If that is their goal, then I don't think they're doing anything right now that will make that goal at least less likely. What I think they're doing is an attempt to deter Iran and to get it to shift, to change its geostrategic calculus so that they come to the understanding that they have more to lose by not negotiating with the United States than they do by staying put.
Knowing all of what Iran has been doing, do you think Iran's going to change calculus right now?
We'll have to see. Well, one thing we know when it comes to a lot of America's adversaries is they respond and do more of what it is we're looking for when we present a stick as opposed to carrots. A regime like Iran has a demonstrated track record, I should say, of responding to pressure far more than to gifts and goodies. I think the same could, of course, be said of Russia. So we're with a president right now who it's a bit of a catch-22 where we want to do more, talk tougher, but at the same time, we don't actually want to do more. We withdrew from assets from Syria, and now, of course, we've put them back in. So it's a political interplay, as you point out to, and it certainly exists in the United States. My concern is, as your question indicated, whether the United States would be as united enough to come together in the face of that threat, as opposed to just finger pointing. Like, I think it is, frankly, the worst type of negotiating strategy if one side of the political aisle that's running for the presidency in a few years is openly declaring that we would like to get right back into the deal. Well, how do you think that message is received in Tehran? That's not, doesn't show really good strategic thinking necessarily. So I'd like to see this issue not as politicized. I think you've seen people like Senator Rubio very recently tweet that we're supposed to be united, in all caps, states against this type of a threat. And I think that's very important. And I'd like to think that our country is that way and would remain that way in the face of dangerous threats, and especially stand by our allies who certainly require that and rely on that.
It's an interesting point that, becoming united against the Iranian regime, but also the region is not very united against the Iranian regime. And if we look at the Gulf, we know that Qatar has a different position towards the different attitude altogether towards the Iranian regime versus Saudi Arabia and UAE. It's a little bit more friendly country to Iran, and then the same thing applies to Turkey. So how would the region respond to this type of escalation that we're seeing? And if things become even worse, are we going to see Qatar declaring its support to the Iranian regime, knowing that now on Al Jazeera in Arabic, it's actually a very pro-Iranian regime coverage, basically with threats and telling the world how strong the Iranian response is going to be to so-and-so, such and such. So what do you expect we're going to see? This is a really also a divided region, not only the world. And we were going to talk about Israel, because Israel has a very important role in this.
No, I think it's hard to say this far out exactly how the region would respond. I don't think anybody is eager to go to war right now. I don't think Iran's allies really want an escalation. I don't think their opponents want one. So, I think we'll have to see what happens if there is, and how they would respond. I would say something just going back to one of your earlier points, and what Matt also said, is the question of what would happen if if a Democrat were to win the White House and re-enter the JCPOA. And one thing I would note though is that the JCPOA sunsets very soon, and as well as in the key provisions in the UN Security Council resolution that was tied to it. The arms embargo, which Iran has been violating anyway, expires in 2020. The non-binding prohibition on ballistic missiles, which of course Iran has also been ignoring, expires in 2023. And then of course in 2025, Iran can resume enriching uranium and would have a very short breakout time to the bomb. So I think as this debate unfolds and as the presidential debate unfolds, I think any president who hopes to succeed President Trump, just simply saying we're going to re-enter the JCPOA is not a viable long-term strategy, because presumably if Trump is defeated, his successor will want to serve 2 terms. And therefore he or she will need a strategy for a post-JCPOA future. And they better start thinking about that on their first day in office, because if they wait till 2025, when sanctions by that point will presumably have been lifted, they're not going to have a whole lot of leverage to deal with Iran. And then if you have no economic leverage at all, well, then you're really facing the possibility of a military escalation, because then what other option do we actually have? So to go back to your question, I think our strategy right now has to be to boost that leverage. And I think the more we have leverage, the more we cause real economic pain to Iran, then I think the less likely it is that Iran will counter-respond in a way that causes an explosion in the Middle East.
Would you like to comment on that?
I would say he gives me more hope, which is good. So as far as the character of the United States, sometimes you look at TV or you read Twitter and you think to yourself, my Lord, what is happening? It's a sewer in here. But he's right, of course. It's hard to mount a successful campaign based on something that is already fast forwarded to the end date, where Iran simply gets the nuclear weapon should it decide screws turn away. That's hard to say that and have, I think, most American people buy into that. I think you also bring up a very valid point that, so I put it diplomatically, some of our allies in the region don't act as much like allies, a bit more like frenemies. They certainly posture more. They certainly use media as information operations. They do that frequently. There's no doubt that there's been a Cold War between 2 factions within the Gulf right now. And I think those that we have been standing by more, and I think that's Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they certainly are ones who seem to be saying and on a path toward what we like to see more. I think the United States, this is something that becomes even more difficult. Again, why I have hope listening to what he says is because in a media age here where we're used to everything now, your response right now, our military needs to be thinking far into the future. We need to be thinking, if this is the way that for a demonstrated period of time, certain countries that we have NATO bases, that we have military assets are going to be stationed there, and then those countries are going to be using that to think to themselves, you know what, I can say whatever I want. We have the base. The United States isn't going to move here. Now I can get close to their enemy, and I can be on both sides. I think we need to be thinking about this long-term and strategically, who we want to be partnered with. And I think if we make new agreements with countries, this is going to have to be stressed from the outset.
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking here very clearly about political Islam, which is, we see some countries in the region that are, like Turkey, like Qatar, who support it. And, the Iranian regime obviously is the head of this whole movement. And we saw Qatar's involvement also with Hamas, with providing money. But now I want to talk a little bit about the Israeli position on this whole change of situation. I mean, Israel has been in the forefront, targeting Iranian militias inside of Syria for years now. But when we see this escalation, what can we, and obviously we know what's going on in Gaza, what do we expect or what can we see? I mean, how much can Israel do, really, if there is an out war in the region between the countries in the Gulf, probably the United States, and the Iranian regime? Let's not even mention, maybe not the United States. I mean, how much Israel could be involved in this?
I think here's kind of how I look at it. First of all, as you say quite correctly, when I'm asked about Iran's what they're doing inside of Syria now obviously for years throughout the Civil War, the United States didn't have or doesn't have a authorization to use military force against Iran. So quite frankly, it's been only the Israelis who have been targeting these type of Iranian assets, their militias, and the type of weapons that they're bringing in. In fact, this is why we've seen a shift in the missile production and the missile storage out of Syria, where Israel has made quite a strong case over the course of several years that we will strike anything if it's over there. That has been their position.
Yeah.
So now they've been shifting to Iraq and, of course, into Lebanon, where Netanyahu has, of course, said that they're being hosted right in civilian centers, right at the Hariri International Airport. I mean, not a good sign from Hezbollah, of course. Now, one aspect that I think should be thought of if you were thinking of trying to provoke both the United States, its Gulf allies, and Israel, is Israel has done a kind of maintenance. It sees these weapons coming in and it destroys them. It provides a lot of intelligence. It is doing that as a matter of course. There is no authorization for military force. There is no discussion like inside of Israel, well, should we do this? Of course, of course they should, and that's what they think across the spectrum. The United States has a different threshold. So if you could look at it from Israel does all of this on a daily basis, something higher from Iran needs to occur before the United States does something. And when they do, there's nothing like the B-52 and other assets that, of course, the United States is using, with pictures now to send as a message. There's nothing like that. So when the United States acts, it's large. The U.S., we don't do small.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's how we are going to see things. But Israel has a demonstrated track record of looking after its own interest and very much, I think, more than most, enforcing its red lines, as it is repeatedly declared when it came to the situation in Syria.
Well, Israel basically said over and over again that they're not going to accept any Iranian presence in Syria, which is a very, high-level request. How do you think Israel is going to make this happen? And what are we going to be seeing from Israel? I mean, going back to the older question.
Well, I think Matt is absolutely right. I mean, Israel has a demonstrated track record of responding to threats in Syria when it sees them, and I expect that to the extent that those threats continue, Israel will respond. It's just really that simple.
So yeah, you don't want to go deeper. I mean, what about talking in terms of any possible collaboration between Israel and other Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE in the face of the Iranian threats to the region?
Well, I think what's been actually pretty remarkable about the post-JCPOA era is that it has actually led to a thawing of relations between Israel and the Arab states, such as Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not overt. They're not having peace summits per se. They're not, the the Saudis aren't embracing Zionism or singing the Israeli national anthem. But what we are seeing, though, I think is an almost unprecedented degree of dialogue between the two, and a willingness to look past differences, say, over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in order to deal with what they perceive to be a shared threat. For all of the anti-Israel rhetoric that may come out of the Saudi regime, the Saudis know full well that Israel doesn't really pose a threat to them. And they know that the threat is coming from Iran, and they know that Israel is best positioned to combat that threat and to work together with them. So while I don't necessarily expect that Israel and the Arab states are going to be overtly singing each other's praises or reconciling or saying that all the past is forgotten, I do think, based on just the events of the last few years, that Israel and the Arab states will continue working together to combat the Iranian threat.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we saw also an escalation in the threats by the Ayatollah Khamenei, who's saying that they already have enough uranium to create the bomb. I mean, they're saying that we can do it now. We don't even have to wait for the 2025. Do you believe in this?
Yeah.
I mean,
Isn't
they
it
already
interesting that
have
they're
that.
trying to say, on one hand, they're arguing, Europe, put pressure on the United States, get back in the deal works, and they want Europe to say that. And at the same time, the deal doesn't do anything, really. We have all this material anyways, so whatever,
Yeah.
right?
We're just going to make it happen.
This is not
now.
intuitive if you're trying to make a
Is he
case.
lying? I mean, do they have the uranium they need? Because this has also been feared from others, knowing that the so-called inspectors in the inspection sites were not fully allowed. I mean, they were not able to access everything. There's underground facilities that were never been inspected by under the JCPOA.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, for starters, the JCPOA didn't actually result in Iran dismantling any of its nuclear infrastructure. So it has the ability to, even if it were fully complying with the deal and not engaging in any covert illicit activity, it has the ability to resume its nuclear activity pretty rapidly if it should so choose. Now, having said that, I think one of the key flaws of the nuclear deal was that it did not guarantee full access to all of Iran's covert facilities. And as a result, it's certainly possible that there's illicit behavior and nuclear development going on. So when the Supreme Leader says that they can resume enriching uranium at any time, I take them at his word. Now, the fact, though, that so far his threats, and to the extent that he's begun to violate the nuclear deal, at least overtly, by increasing their stockpiles of heavy water and uranium, these are actually pretty incremental violations. It's not what I would describe as a rapid breakout towards the bomb. And I think the very fact that all Iran feels comfortable threatening right now is to make these kind of incremental violations rather than say, we are going to start developing a bomb today and rush to break out and resume enriching uranium across our declared nuclear facilities. The fact that it hasn't done any of that, I think, is a sign that they're afraid because they know what the consequences are. So I think I'm repeating myself here, but this is all, again, a sign of weakness on the part of the regime.
I would add to that, when you look at what the Mossad apparently took out of Tehran as far as the nuclear archives. Okay, this may date back some time, but then you look at the independent research that's been conducted on it, another paper that came out very recently. The more you look into that, no one is walking away who looks at that information and thinks to themselves, Iran was far better behaved than we thought. Everything looks worse. Their program seemed further along. Their what they've done, how they've planned, how they've maintained the plans to have these type of weapons. It's all there. It points to the fact that one would not err on the side of, well, I think we'll be okay. One would err on the side of,
this is really dangerous.
Exactly, and that we should act accordingly.
We also saw that there is now the American embassy in Baghdad is asking its not, most important employees to basically come back to the United States. The same thing, ExxonMobil in Basra. Why are we seeing these fears of basically some threats in Iraq? Why now and why Iraq? Are we on the lookout for something to happen against the American companies and possible, the embassy itself?
I can't speak to the specific nature of the intelligence that the administration has. I take them at their word. If there's a threat, there probably is one. Is it necessarily new? Probably not, because this malign conduct has been going on for many years. So I don't necessarily have much to add on that point. Regarding actually just the point that Matt just made regarding the archive, I think he's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that the archive showed was that there was a great deal we learned from the archive suggesting that Iran's nuclear activities expanded far more beyond than what we previously knew. There were facilities, equipment, activity that Iran had never previously declared to the IAEA that we learned about in the archive. And precisely because the nuclear deal did not require Iran to provide that full declaration and cooperate with the IAEA for its investigation of Iran's past nuclear activities, that suggests that there might be a lot of covert activity continuing to this day. And that's why I think it's very important that the IAEA act upon the revelations in the archive. And so far, if they have been doing so, they haven't said so publicly. And given the IAEA's track record, there's probably good reason to fear that these sites are not being inspected.
Mm-hmm. Matt, I mean, when I asked about ExxonMobil's employees, because, you know, is that related to the American request to Iraq to pump up their oil production, which is going to hurt the Iranian oil production and economy, obviously with the sanctions and the elimination of waivers even more? Is that related to that? Are they trying to threaten the American, you know, oil companies that are working in Iraq?
Sure, that's what they're trying to do in the Straits of Hormuz, and that's why, again, this is just they're trying to lay down certain markers of threats that they can make. In, you know, just if they can attack a tanker here and it's not huge damage, it's not forcing a response necessarily, but what it is doing is certainly sending the message that we can make it very hard for all of these vessels going through. I think when it comes to the warning that the State Department made in Iraq, I hear from people on the ground there, and when you're there as an American and your days have gone like this for a long time, and then suddenly you see things happening around you, these are reasons to be a lot more cautious. And I think a president would be remiss in their responsibility if he doesn't look after that and issue such a warning.
Okay. Lastly, before I let you guys go, because I know you have to run, Russia. What does Russia's role would be, or we're going to expect from Russia? I mean, is that falls in its interest, what's happening between the United States and Iran? Because Iran, it's Russia's ally in the region. It does collaborate with other countries, but Iran is a closer country to Russia than the rest. But at the same time, some argue that this actually is in Russia's interest because it empowers its role in trying to always be kind of, calming things down or managing the situation with the United States. What do you think?
Well, Russia has long been a strategic partner of Iran. They have worked together to foment chaos in Syria. They've worked together militarily. At one point, Iran was even providing airfields for use of Russian military planes. So there's been a long record of this collaboration. Obviously, I think the Russians are not thrilled with what the U.S. is doing right now, but there's not a whole lot they have the ability to do. So in the end, I think the Russians are going to continue standing by Iran to the extent that they can, but they're certainly in a weaker position today as a result of U.S. policy.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Matt?
I think it's not realistic for the United States to count on Russia to do anything that we want in a friendly manner. I think, like Iran, they need to see resolve from the United States. I think, obviously, what the United States is doing in Syria to try to reestablish leverage after essentially ceding it to Iran under the Obama administration, it's a complex strategy, but a lot of that has to do with Russia came in militarily thinking that after it liberated the oil fields in northeastern Syria for Assad, that he would suddenly be making money off of the oil. That was a deal that was struck between Assad and Putin, and the United States is maintaining leverage by working with allies there and making sure that reconstruction money does not start flowing, that the spigots don't open to Assad and his cronies, which of course Assad is with Iran and Russia. We were making sure that that doesn't happen to the greatest extent we can. And of course, it's helpful if all parts of the administration are getting that message across strongly, but we'll see how that develops. But the bottom line is that the idea that is floated every year that we should get together with Russia because we have so much in common and we can work things out. It's not the reality. Putin knows it's not the reality. He expects this. That's why he sits there and waits for every election where the next person comes in as president and tries what's been tried and failed before.
I mean, this conversation is really interesting. That was a really great conversation here too. Thank you so much, and would love to have you again in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for watching us. Good night.